Welcome to fishing with the Power Fishing Pro Hybrid Electric Fishing Reel. With Dan Galusha, inductee to the Freshwater Fishing Hall of Fame. Today, Dan will be demonstrating pan fishing with a float and lure using the Power Fishing Pro Reel.
Today we're going to be talking about fishing a jig under a float for panfish. You can use any sort of a small jig that you want. This particular one is just a regular old lead head with a gulp pinch of night crawler on it. I'm going to be tying a king sling knot. I always like using this with small jigs. It will always allow the jig to spring back up to where you want it. It's a loop knot basically. And what you do is you take it just like this, put the two together, put your finger here, and wrap it 4 times. Now you take the jig, put it through that loop where your finger's at. Bring it all the way through, bring it up, cinch it. Now you got the little loop, and the jig always hangs just like that. I like using ice fishing jigs year-round and putting something on them. No, there's even a live waxworm, but the crappie nibbles work well too. There's a lot of good prepared baits. This float is what's called a weighted float. You can see the weight right here at the bottom. But if you use a standard float, and you can do that with this too, but you do what's called balancing. You'd put more weight down here beside your jig, and you'd balance it so that just the surface of the water would come, say, right to here, so that the float would have less resistance when the fish pulls it under, or you'd see what's called a lift bite, where they'll hit it, and it'll actually allow the float to rise above the surface. That's the same as if they just get up and go and zap bite. So either way you'll see that, and that's what's called balancing a float. But we're not going to worry with that today. We're just going to use this lead, and we're going to use the weight of the jig. Okay, there's different techniques that you can use. One of the things I like to do, and unfortunately we don't have that today, is in a windy situation, you'll actually let the float do the jigging for you. As the waves bounce along, the jig will just go like this with the float. We're going to have to do that ourselves today, so we'll see what happens. After casting it, I'll just let it sit there for a little bit. As you can see, the surface of the water is relatively calm, so there's nothing happening with that float. It's just sitting there. And the way the fishing's been, we're going to want a little bit of a movement to it. What I'll do is just barely hit the button and wind up the slack, and then take the rod tip and just quiver that float. You can see it bob, and then I want to stop. Sometimes I'll just pull it up like this and let it go. What that's doing is that's pulling that jig up so high, letting it drop back down. Do a little bit of bobbing again, because you're actually moving that jig. Whatever that float's doing on the surface, it's doing the same thing to the jig underneath there. And there are times when the fish they will absolutely not hit anything where they're going to be moving. Then you just got to let it sit there and just barely take the rod and move it like that and stop. This is just the basics of fishing a jig under a float. Float fishing is a science in itself. So if you're looking for more, just look up on the internet. You'd be amazed at how much you can do with just a single float.
Using these techniques, along with the Power Fishing Pro, you can fish longer without fatigue, have more options and techniques for catching fish, and enjoy fishing even more.